5:58 a.m. on a Tuesday, the air in my master bedroom was perfectly silent. The only sound was the faint cyclical hum of the advanced air filtration system I had installed 3 years ago when I bought the house. The temperature was set to precisely 68 degrees. It was a sterile, optimized environment, built entirely to ensure peak cognitive recovery after a 70-hour work week. At 6 a.m., my memory foam mattress vibrated with the violent force of a sledgehammer striking the reinforced oak double doors on the ground floor. The sound wasn't the tentative knock of a neighbor. It was a synchronized, rhythmic assault. It vibrated up through the steel frame of the house, detonating the adrenaline reservoir in my brain with a shockwave of raw biological panic. I wasn't awake. I was instantly, violently, fully aware of a critical threat to my safe zone. I didn't breathe for a second. My heart rate didn't accelerate, and it jumped from resting to maximal aerobic output. "Sheriff's office! Open the door!" The booming, authoritative command carrying from the street was amplified by a megaphone. It was engineered to cause submission. I didn't react with emotional confusion. The corporate training protocols clicked into place. In a crisis, you neutralize the biological response and analyze the mechanism. I rolled out of bed, grabbing the smartphone from the charging pad. I didn't waste time checking the time. I knew it was dawn. The time when police execute high-risk orders. I activated the integrated security dashboard for the entire estate. The high-definition monitor displayed 16 camera feeds. The front camera, mounted under the eaves, showed 2 uniformed county deputies and a police sergeant in tactical vests standing on my porch. One deputy was wielding a heavy metal dynamic entry ram, preparing for a 4th strike. With 2 more black and white patrol SUVs were angled across the base of my driveway. I didn't open the door. I walked to the window overlooking the front porch, opened it 2 inches, and activated the external intercom system. "I am the legal owner of this property," I announced, my voice completely level, devoid of any daughterly warmth or fear, speaking directly into the microphone. "I am standing at the upstairs window. I can see you. Yes, why are you assaulting my front door?" The deputy with the ram stopped mid-swing. The police sergeant looked up, a wave of irritation visible on his face through the night vision-capable optics. He didn't offer a friendly explanation. "We are here to execute a mandatory expedited writ of possession issued by the county civil court," the sergeant barked, pointing to a manila envelope in his left hand. "The order demands the immediate removal of all occupants. I have an authorized lockmaster sitting in a patrol vehicle ready to breach this entry. Open the door now, or we will perform a forced entry and you will be liable for the structural damage." The air in the bedroom, writ of possession without an underlying judgment, which requires a lengthy, unlawful detainer lawsuit, hearings, and a final order from a presiding judge. When I had been sitting in this house for 3 years, I didn't have a mortgage. I paid my property taxes. I had never been served with a lawsuit. It was a legal impossibility. "One moment," I stated. I walked down the steel staircase, ignoring the cold of the polished concrete floor on my bare feet. I unlocked the 4 deadbolts and pulled the heavy oak door open. The air outside was freezing and tasted of November neblina. The sergeant didn't waste time with introductions. When he aggressively thrust the manila envelope into my hands, "You have exactly 20 minutes to gather essentials," the sergeant ordered, looking past me into the house as if already calculating how to catalog my furniture. "I have a mandatory move-out crew scheduled to arrive at 7 a.m. Any personal property remaining on the premises will be placed on the curb and considered abandoned." The raw, institutional cruelty of the process was stunning. That he was talking about liquidating my life's anchor as an administrative item on his morning checklist. I didn't argue. Arguments with police executing a valid-appearing court order are a tactical failure. I needed the raw data. I pulled the legal documents from the envelope. It was a 5-page packet stamped with the official blue ink of the county court. Writ of restitution and possession. Petitioner, Arthur and Eleanor Vance. Respondent, the Chief Executive Officer. Case number CV2145091. A judgment of foreclosure/ejectment entered October 12th, 2023. The names hit me like a physical punch. Arthur and Eleanor, my parents. The people I had allowed to manage my private files and basic finance operations while I was overseas building my logistics company 6 years ago. I analyzed the legal mechanism they had used. The writ referenced an underlying judgment of foreclosure from 2023. This meant my parents hadn't just sued me for squatter removal. They had gone to a civil court, to committed sewer service fraud, claiming I was served with a lawsuit I never received, got a default judgment and claimed I defaulted on a private mortgage note that I allegedly signed years ago. They engineered a legal default, and this deputy was just the weapon they were using to pull the trigger. The sergeant checked his watch. 15 minutes. I move. I turned the page to look at the copy of the original judgment of foreclosure that the judge had supposedly signed to authorize this eviction, and that was when I stopped reading. I grounded myself in facts. In 2021, when they claimed I defaulted on the mortgage note, I wasn't even in the country. My assets were in a blind trust. Then I looked at the bottom of the 4th page of the paperwork, at the mandatory underlying case number that validated the entire judicial order. Pursuant to judgment of foreclosure under case number CVIV 2145,091. The blood completely drained from my face. It wasn't the panic of being evicted. It was the absolute catastrophic realization of how breathtakingly arrogant and clumsy their forgery actually was. They thought a CEO in the middle of a dawn eviction wouldn't audit the case numbers. They thought I would just panic seeing a court stamp. Actually, Sergeant, I stated, my voice losing its cooperative neutral tone, each sharpening into the freezing absolute clarity of an impending tactical nuclear strike. I looked up from the paperwork and met his tired, irritated eyes. We are not going to be moving my furniture, and you are not going to perform a forced entry. The sergeant frowned, shifting his weight. You have a court order demanding your removal, lady. I don't care about your complaints. Move, or I will authorize an arrest for obstruction. You don't care about my complaints, I corrected him smoothly, tapping my manicured index finger against the impossible case number on the paperwork. But you do care about judicial jurisdiction. You are trying to execute a writ of possession based on case number CV 2145091. That is correct, the sergeant said, impatient. Sergeant, that case number is real, I explained, the cool logic descending over me, replacing the biological adrenaline. But that case number, CV 2145,091, was not for a mortgage foreclosure. In 2021, where I utilized case number CV 2145,091 to file a standard approved municipal zoning variance application to install the integrated security system and reinforced fencing on this exact property. The case was finalized, approved, and administratively closed 3 years ago. I watched his facial expression shift from bureaucratic arrogance to profound, terrified confusion. This is not a real court order, I stated, the finality of my words echoing on the cold morning air. My parents found a real case number from a public zoning variance file they had access to years ago. They clumsily cut and pasted it onto a fabricated foreclosure judgment, forged a presiding judge's signature, and utilized sewer service fraud to trick a municipal clerk into processing the writ. The deputy with the ram looked at the sergeant. The police megaphone amplified the silence in the neighborhood. I have the approved, notarized municipal zoning final order from 2021 inside, bearing this exact case number, I provided, the trap snapping shut with absolute irreversible finality. Arthur and Eleanor didn't just commit a civil fraud, They just utilized a dynamic entry RAM and the entire county sheriff's office as their personal weapon to execute a felony forgery against a private citizen. You are executing an archival ghost. The sergeant slowly took the manila envelope back from my hands. He didn't look at the other pages. He stared at the case number on the writ, realizing that the entire procedural mechanism of the law was currently collapsing in real time under the weight of a single, meticulously audited, impossible data point. The sergeant did not immediately lower his guard, but the aggressive, forward-leaning posture of his unit shifted. He unclipped the heavy black radio from his tactical vest, his eyes never leaving my face. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4 Bravo." The sergeant keyed the mic, and the static hissed sharply in the cold morning air. "Run a priority verification on a civil docket number. Charlie Victor 21450901. I need the case classification and current status." The silence on the porch stretched out. The deputy holding the dynamic entry RAM lowered it slightly, the heavy steel resting against the toe of his boot. I stood in the doorway, the freezing concrete leaching the heat from my bare feet, waiting for the county's digital infrastructure to catch up to reality. 30 seconds later, the radio crackled. 4 Bravo dispatch, that docket is closed. Classification is a municipal zoning variance for perimeter security modifications. Finalized October 2021. No civil litigation or foreclosure attached. The sergeant's jaw clenched. The irritation that had been aimed at me was instantly redirected toward the manila envelope in his hand. Police officers, or especially those commanding tactical units, do not like being weaponized by civilians to commit illegal acts under the color of law. If they had breached my door based on a forged writ, the resulting civil rights lawsuit against the department would have been catastrophic. "Stand down," the sergeant barked to his men. The deputy with the RAM backed away from the oak door. The sergeant pulled the forged writ from the packet, separated the staple, and handed the pages back to me. "This is a fabricated document," the sergeant stated, his tone flat and heavily disciplined. "The signature belongs to Judge Thomas Sterling, presiding over the 3rd District. Forging a magistrate's signature on a court order to utilize law enforcement is a Class B felony. But my unit executes orders. We don't investigate financial crimes. You need to take this to the district attorney's fraud division immediately." "I will," I replied, folding the heavy paper. "Thank you, Sergeant." They didn't apologize. They didn't need to. They packed the RAM into the back of the SUV, killed the flashing tactical lights, and reversed out of my driveway. I closed the heavy oak door and locked the 4 deadbolts. The sterile silence of the house returned, but the psychological landscape had entirely shifted. My parents had crossed a terminal line. They hadn't just sued me, they had tried to physically drag me out of my own home at dawn. They were desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. I walked back up to the master bedroom and sat at the security dashboard. I pulled up the high-definition perimeter cameras and began systematically scrubbing the live feeds, covering the surrounding 2 blocks. If you orchestrate a tactical police raid on your own daughter, you don't wait for the news at home. You watch it happen. I switched to the camera mounted on the street lamp at the edge of the cul-de-sac. I zoomed in on the grainy, low-light feed. And parked under the shadow of a massive oak tree 300 yards down the street was a dark, silver Lexus sedan. The engine was idling. Through the windshield, the faint glow of a dashboard screen illuminated 2 silhouettes in the front seats, Arthur and Eleanor. They had parked just far enough away to avoid police detection, but close enough to watch the patrol SUVs block my driveway. They had sat there in the freezing dawn, drinking coffee in their heated leather seats, eagerly waiting to see me pulled onto the lawn in handcuffs. Now, they were watching the police pack up and leave without me. The confusion in that car must have been suffocating. I didn't send them a message. I didn't walk down the street to confront them. When an enemy doesn't know why their weapon misfired, you don't explain the malfunction. You let them panic. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus, my corporate litigator. It was 6:20 a.m. He answered on the third ring. His voice thick with sleep. "I am sending you a high-resolution scan of a forged writ of possession," I instructed, placing the physical document on the glass surface of my desk scanner. "My parents just used it to send a tactical sheriff's unit to my front door. They forged the signature of District Judge Thomas Sterling." I heard the sound of Marcus sitting up rapidly, a coffee cup clattering against a nightstand. The sleep vanished from his voice instantly. "They forged a sitting judge's signature to orchestrate an armed eviction?" Marcus asked, the legal severity of the crime cutting through the phone line. "That isn't a civil dispute. That is a direct assault on the judicial branch. If we take this to the police, they'll assign a detective, and it will take months to get an indictment." "We are not taking it to the police," I replied, watching the scanner laser sweep across the forged blue ink. "If we file a standard police report, my parents will hire a defense attorney, claim they bought the document from a fraudulent online eviction service, and play the victims. They will drag this out for years while living in the guest house of my secondary property." I pulled the scanned PDF onto my monitor. The signature of Judge Sterling was a remarkably good visual copy, but a visual copy doesn't hold up to institutional scrutiny. "I want you to bypass the police," I told Marcus, my eyes locked on the forged signature. I want you to draft an emergency, ex parte motion for a protective order and sanctions. But you are not going to file it in the General Civil Clerk's office. You are going to file it directly in the chambers of Judge Thomas Sterling. You want to hand the forged signature directly to the judge who supposedly signed it," Marcus summarized, the tactical brilliance of the move dawning on him. "Exactly," I confirmed. "I want Judge Sterling to look at the document that was used to impersonate his authority. He won't wait for a police detective to investigate. A judge whose signature is forged to command an armed police unit will utilize the full, immediate, and terrifying power of his own bench." "I'll have the emergency motion drafted by 8 a.m., Marcus promised. "But what are you going to do about your parents right now? They are going to realize the eviction failed. They will try to cover their tracks." "Let them try," I said softly, looking back at the live security feed. The silver Lexus was finally moving. The brake lights flared red in the pre-dawn gloom before the car slowly accelerated, turning out of the neighborhood and disappearing into the morning traffic. They were retreating to regroup. They thought they had simply hit a bureaucratic snag. They thought the police had been too lazy to execute the order. And they didn't know I had the forged document sitting on my desk. My phone vibrated on the glass surface. A new text message illuminated the screen. "Arthur Vance, we need to talk about the house. The situation is escalating. Let's handle this privately before the county gets involved again. Meet us at our lawyer's office at noon." I read the text twice. They were trying to pivot from armed eviction to extortion in less than 20 minutes. It was almost impressive in its sociopathy. I replied. Printed the scanned forgery, placed it into a heavy leather portfolio, and went upstairs to shower. I had a meeting with a judge. The 3rd District County Courthouse opened to the public at 8 a.m. Marcus and I bypassed the sprawling, chaotic lines at the metal detectors by utilizing the dedicated attorney access portal. We didn't go to the civil filing windows on the 1st floor. We took the service elevator directly to the restricted judicial corridors on the 4th floor. The hallway outside Chamber 4B was quiet, lined with thick navy carpet that absorbed the sound of footsteps. A single bailiff sat at a wooden desk outside the heavy mahogany door, drinking coffee from a paper cup. Marcus approached the desk and handed the bailiff a single sheet of paper, an emergency ex parte request for an audience. "Counselor, Judge Sterling is reviewing morning dockets," the bailiff said, glancing at the paper without moving to open the door. "Unless this is a stay of execution, you need to file this with the clerk and wait for a calendar date. It's a fraud upon the court involving a forged writ of possession bearing the judge's signature, executed by a tactical sheriff's unit 2 hours ago," Marcus stated, keeping his voice low but completely rigid. "If His Honor wants to wait for a calendar date while armed deputies enforce fake orders in his name, I will gladly file it downstairs." The bailiff stopped drinking his coffee, and he looked at Marcus, then looked at the heavy leather portfolio in my hand. He stood up, unlocked the chamber door, and stepped inside. Less than 30 seconds later, the door swung wide open. Judge Thomas Sterling's chambers did not look like a courtroom. It looked like a working library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, and the air smelled heavily of old binding glue and stale espresso. Sterling was in his late 50s, sitting behind a massive, cluttered desk, wearing reading glasses and a standard dress shirt, his black robe hanging on a coat rack in the corner. "Sit," Judge Sterling instructed, not looking up from a file he was signing. He finished his signature, closed the folder, and finally directed his attention to us. "My bailiff tells me someone is issuing tactical deployment orders using my bench. Show me." I sat in the leather guest chair opposite his desk. I opened the portfolio, or extracted the physical copy of the forged 5-page packet the police sergeant had handed me at dawn, and slid it across the polished wood. Judge Sterling picked up the document. He didn't react immediately. He possessed the disciplined, analytical patience of a man who spent decades dissecting legal arguments. He read the front page, his eyes tracking the petitioner names, Arthur and Eleanor Vance, and the case number. Then he turned to page 4, and he stared at his own signature at the bottom of the judgment of foreclosure. The silence in the chamber was heavy, punctuated only by the faint hum of the building's HVAC system. Sterling reached into a drawer, pulled out a jeweler's loupe, and leaned over the document, examining the blue ink of the signature line. "The stroke pressure is completely flat," Judge Sterling noted, his voice dropping into a quiet, dangerous register. "It's a high-quality vector print, likely scanned from a standard civil ruling I issued months ago and laser printed onto this page. But the real failure is the metadata." He tapped the end of his pen against the docket number at the top of the page. "Case CV 2145,091. Sterling read aloud. He turned to his computer monitor and typed the number into the county's secure judicial database. A moment later, a green checkmark appeared on his screen. "This is a closed municipal zoning variance from 2021. Now, the petitioners took a real docket number from a public file, pasted it onto a fake foreclosure template, forged my signature, and used it to bypass the civil clerk to directly request a sheriff's eviction." Judge Sterling took his reading glasses off and placed them carefully on the desk. He looked at me. "The county tactical unit breached your property this morning?" he asked. "They attempted to," I answered, keeping my tone strictly factual. They deployed a dynamic entry ram and demanded immediate evacuation. I stopped the breach by providing the original 2021 zoning variance paperwork bearing the matching docket number. The sergeant verified the anomaly with dispatch and retreated. "Your parents utilized the county sheriff's department as a private armed extortion squad," Sterling summarized. The quiet anger radiating from the judge was far more effective than any yelling could ever be. A forged check is a financial crime. A forged judicial order weaponizing law enforcement is a direct, catastrophic insult to the authority of the court itself. Sterling picked up his desk phone and pressed a single intercom button. "Sarah," Sterling said to his clerk in the outer office, "I need you to contact the captain of the sheriff's Criminal Investigations Division. Tell him to send 2 senior detectives to my chambers immediately and lock docket CV-21-45091. Nobody accesses it without my biometric clearance." He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, resting his hands on the armrests. "I am issuing a bench warrant for the immediate arrest of Arthur and Eleanor Vance on charges of felony forgery, perjury, and impersonating a judicial officer," Sterling stated, the legal machinery fully engaging. "The detectives will pick them up at their residence." "They aren't at their residence, Your Honor," I interjected smoothly. Eviction fail from a parked car down the eviction fail from a parked car down the street, I explained, letting the facts build the trap. They believe the police simply encountered a bureaucratic delay. 20 minutes after the deputies left, Arthur sent me this message. They are attempting to pivot. Did they want me to meet them at their lawyer's office at noon today to negotiate a private settlement? Judge Sterling read the glowing screen of the phone. A cold, highly calibrated smile touched the corners of his mouth. They want to extort you using a forged document they believe is still an active threat, Sterling noted, handing the phone back to me. He looked at Marcus. Counselor, knew who is representing the petitioners in this supposed negotiation. A local civil litigator named Gregson, Marcus replied. His office is in the commercial district downtown. Mr. Gregson is about to have a very bad afternoon, Sterling murmured. He picked up his pen and pulled a blank blue-bordered judicial summons form from his tray. We are not going to send detectives to a lawyer's office to cause a scene. We are going to let them walk willingly into a controlled environment. Judge Sterling began writing rapidly on the summons form. I am issuing an emergency, mandatory subpoena for Arthur and Eleanor Vance and their counsel of record to appear in my courtroom 4A at exactly 2 p.m. today, Sterling dictated as he wrote. The stated purpose of the hearing will be an emergency review of writ of possession. Your parents will receive this subpoena in an hour. They will think the court is finally enforcing their fake eviction. They will walk into my courtroom expecting to watch you lose your house. Sterling stamped the summons with the heavy steel seal of the county court. The thud echoed in the quiet chamber. Let them believe they are winning, the judge finalized, handing the sealed document to Marcus. I will see you both at 2 o'clock. Courtroom 4A was entirely empty when Marcus and I took our seats at the respondents' table at 1:45 p.m., and the overhead fluorescent lights hummed with a low, constant frequency. I placed my leather portfolio on the scratched wooden table and waited. At 1:55 p.m., the heavy double doors at the back of the gallery swung open. Arthur and Eleanor walked down the center aisle. They did not look like people who had spent the morning parked in the shadows watching a failed police raid. They looked like people arriving to collect a winning lottery ticket. Arthur wore a tailored charcoal suit. Eleanor carried a designer handbag she had likely purchased on the assumption that she was about to inherit a multi-million-dollar estate. Walking slightly ahead of them was a man in his late 40s, carrying a thick litigation briefcase. Their lawyer, Gregson. Gregson set his briefcase down on the petitioner's table. He unclasped the brass locks with a sharp click and began arranging his files. Arthur and Eleanor sat down next to him, and Eleanor glanced across the 10 feet of empty space separating our tables. She didn't glare. She offered a small, patronizing smile, the exact expression of a mother preparing to discipline a disobedient child. They truly believed Judge Sterling had called this hearing to force the sheriff's department to finish the eviction. I looked back at her. I didn't smile. I just watched the second hand on the wall clock sweep toward the 12. At exactly 2 p.m., the door behind the bench opened. All rise, the bailiff announced. Judge Sterling walked to his heavy leather chair and sat down. He didn't carry the forged document I had given him in chambers. He carried nothing but a blank legal pad and a pen. The courtroom remained completely silent as he adjusted his microphone. Docket CV 2145091, Judge Sterling read into the record, his voice echoing cleanly off the wood-paneled walls. Emergency review regarding a writ of possession. Counsel, identify yourselves. Gregson. To representing the petitioners, Arthur and Eleanor Vance, Your Honor, Gregson stated, standing up and buttoning his jacket. Marcus, representing the respondent, my lawyer replied, remaining seated as is customary during introductions. Judge Sterling folded his hands on the bench and looked directly at Gregson. Mr. Gregson, Sterling began, his tone perfectly neutral, an administrative blank slate. And I called this hearing because there appears to be a significant anomaly regarding the execution of a judgment bearing my signature. Explain your presence." Gregson stood taller, sensing an opportunity to litigate the morning's failure. "Your Honor, we are here to request an immediate order compelling the county sheriff to execute the writ," Gregson argued smoothly, completely unaware he was stepping onto a landmine. "At 6 o'clock this morning, the tactical unit arrived at the respondent's property to enforce a lawful foreclosure judgment. However, the respondent actively obstructed the deputies, citing a clerical error regarding the docket number, and the sheriff's sergeant improperly retreated. We are asking the court to reaffirm the eviction order so my clients can take possession of their rightful property today." Sterling nodded slowly, absorbing the argument. He picked up his pen. "What you are stating for the record that your clients are relying on a final judgment of foreclosure, issued by this specific court to seize the property?" Sterling asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Gregson confirmed. "I have the original 5-page packet right here." "Hand it to the bailiff, please," Sterling instructed. Gregson picked up the manila envelope, the exact same envelope the police sergeant had shoved into my hands at dawn, and handed it to the uniformed bailiff. They passed Gregson directly at Arthur and passed Gregson directly at Arthur and Eleanor. "And Mrs. Vance," Sterling addressed them. Arthur sat up straighter. Eleanor maintained her confident posture. "You provided this document to your attorney. You represent to this court under penalty of perjury that this is a valid, authentic judicial order?" "We do, Your Honor," Arthur answered, and his voice steady. "She defaulted on the note years ago. We are just following the law." "Following the law," Sterling repeated softly. The neutral administrative tone vanished from his voice, replaced by the freezing, absolute authority of the bench. Sterling opened the envelope. He pulled out the 5 pages and laid them flat. He didn't look at the front page. He turned directly to page 4. "Mr. Gregson," Sterling said, his eyes fixed on the paper. "Step forward to the podium." Gregson walked to the wooden podium in the center of the room. "I have been a sitting judge in the 3rd District for 14 years, Sterling stated, the volume of his voice remaining low, forcing everyone in the room to lean in to hear the execution. "In that time, I have signed approximately 11,000 civil orders. I know my own signature." Gregson frowned slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Arthur and Eleanor stopped smiling. "This document," Sterling continued, tapping his index finger against the blue ink at the bottom of the page, "is a remarkably high-quality laser-printed forgery. The stroke pressure is entirely flat. It is a digital vector copy of a signature I applied to a separate ruling months ago." Gregson's hands gripped the edges of the wooden podium. "Your Honor, I am not finished, Counselor," Sterling cut him off, the air in the courtroom suddenly turning heavy and suffocating. "That beyond the physical forgery of my signature, there is the matter of judicial jurisdiction. You stated this is a foreclosure judgment under case number CV2145091. Sterling turned the monitor on his desk so it faced the gallery. The screen displayed the county's secure judicial database. Case CV2145091 is a municipal zoning variance for a residential security fence, filed and closed in October of 2021. Sterling read directly from the screen. It has absolutely nothing to do with a mortgage, a default, or an eviction. The color drained completely out of Gregson's face. He looked back at Arthur and Eleanor, his eyes wide with the sudden, terrifying realization that his own clients had just used him to submit a fabricated document to a federal judge. "Your clients," Sterling continued, looking directly at Arthur and Eleanor, who were now frozen in their chairs, "took a public docket number from a zoning file. I pasted it onto a fake foreclosure template, forged my signature, and used it to dispatch an armed tactical police unit to a private citizen's home at 6 in the morning. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords completely failed. Arthur stared at the wooden table, his chest rising and falling rapidly as his biological panic finally caught up to his arrogance. "Your Honor," Gregson stammered, physically stepping backward away from the podium and putting distance between himself and his clients. My firm had absolutely no knowledge of this anomaly. We were retained yesterday afternoon. The clients provided the documents directly. I must immediately move to withdraw as counsel of record." "Granted," Sterling snapped. "Step away from the table, Mr. Gregson. You are dismissed." Gregson didn't even pack his briefcase. He left it on the table, walked to the back row of the gallery, and sat down, abandoning Arthur and Eleanor entirely. None of the parents were now sitting alone at the petitioner's table. There was no settlement to negotiate. There was no property to seize. They were sitting in a locked courtroom staring at the judge whose signature they had stolen. Judge Sterling picked up his pen and began writing a new order. "Arthur and Eleanor Vance," Sterling pronounced, the finality of his words echoing off the walls. "I am holding you both in direct criminal contempt of court. Furthermore, I am impounding this forged document and transferring it directly to the district attorney's office with a judicial mandate for immediate prosecution." Sterling looked up, his eyes locking onto the parents. "Bailiff," the judge commanded, "take the petitioners into custody." The sound of the bailiff's radio crackled sharply in the sudden, suffocating silence of courtroom 4A. He did not ask Arthur and Eleanor to stand. He walked directly behind their chairs at the petitioner's table. "So hands behind your backs," the bailiff ordered, his voice carrying the flat, practiced authority of a man who executes judicial mandates daily. Arthur's tailored charcoal suit bunched awkwardly as he was forced to comply. The metallic, ratcheting sound of the handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed against the wood paneling. Eleanor did not speak. She stared blankly ahead, her designer handbag slipping from her lap and spilling its contents onto the floor. A gold compact, a heavily used credit card, and the keys to a house she would never own. The patronizing smile she had worn less than 10 minutes ago had been completely erased, replaced by the hollow, rigid shock of sudden incarceration. They were not merely losing a civil dispute. They were being physically restrained inside a federal building, indicted by the very judge whose authority they had attempted to steal. Judge Sterling did not watch them being handcuffed. Then he focused his attention on the stack of paperwork in front of him, prioritizing the integrity of the court over the personal ruin playing out in the well. The ex parte writ of possession, issued under the fabricated authority of Case CV 2145,091, is hereby permanently quashed and expunged from the active civil registry, Sterling dictated to his clerk, his pen moving rapidly across the official court ledger. "No, the clerk will immediately transmit a certified notice of this expungement directly to the captain of the sheriff's civil division, ensuring no further tactical deployments are authorized against the respondent's property under this docket." Sterling stamped the ledger with the heavy municipal seal. He looked up, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "Counselor, does the respondent have any further motions before this court regarding the petitioners?" Sterling asked. Marcus remained seated, when his posture relaxed but entirely professional. "Not at this time, Your Honor. The criminal referrals initiated by the bench address the immediate threat to my client's physical safety and property rights. We will pursue civil remedies for the emotional distress and the costs associated with defending against this fraudulent action in a separate subsequent filing." "Understood," Sterling replied. And he closed the heavy manila folder containing the forged documents and slid it to the edge of his desk. "This hearing is adjourned." The bailiff grasped Arthur and Eleanor by their upper arms and physically guided them toward the side door leading to the courthouse holding cells. As they were led away, Arthur briefly turned his head, his eyes meeting mine across the empty space of the courtroom. There was no defiance left in his expression, only a desperate, unreadable mask. I did not nod. I did not at dawn. I picked up my leather portfolio at dawn. I picked up my leather portfolio and stood up. Marcus joined me, and we walked silently down the center aisle, passing Gregson, Dunn, who was still sitting in the back row, staring blankly at the wall, mentally calculating the catastrophic damage to his firm's reputation. We exited the courtroom and took the elevator down to the lobby. The afternoon sun was breaking through the November overcast, casting long, sharp shadows across the plaza outside the courthouse. The district attorney will likely convene a grand jury within the week based on Sterling's direct referral, Marcus noted as we walked toward the parking garage. While given the physical evidence, the forged signature, the stolen docket number, and the dispatch logs from the sheriff's department, a plea deal is their only viable option to avoid a lengthy trial. They won't go to trial, I agreed, unlocking my car with the remote. They don't have the capital to fund a multi-year defense, and Gregson has already abandoned them. They will take whatever the DA offers. I got into my car and drove back to my estate. The neighborhood was quiet, and the heavy oak front door still bore the faint, superficial scuff marks from the tactical ram, a physical reminder of the violence that had been narrowly averted. I walked inside, the silence of the sterile, optimized environment wrapping around me. The threat had been identified, isolated, and neutralized. The dismantling of Arthur and Eleanor Vance was rapid and comprehensive. The judicial system, when directly assaulted with a forged order, operates with terrifying efficiency. So Judge Sterling's criminal referral bypassed the standard police investigative delays. The district attorney's office, armed with the physical forgery and the sworn testimony of the sheriff's sergeant who had been deployed to execute it, secured a grand jury indictment within 10 days. Arthur and Eleanor were charged with 3 counts of felony forgery, 2 counts of perjury, and 1 count of criminal impersonation of a judicial officer. The severity of the charges, coupled with the undeniable forensic evidence of the copied signature and the mismatched zoning docket number, left their newly appointed public defender with no leverage to negotiate. They pleaded guilty to felony forgery and criminal impersonation. The judge overseeing their criminal sentencing did not offer leniency. Arthur was sentenced to 3 years in a state correctional facility, while Eleanor received a slightly reduced sentence of 2.5 years, when factoring in her secondary role in the physical execution of the fraud. Both sentences included mandatory, extensive financial restitution to cover the costs incurred by the county sheriff's department and my legal fees. Their silver Lexus was repossessed by the bank within a month of their incarceration. The house they had been renting was cleared out by the landlord, their remaining possessions placed in a cheap storage unit they could no longer afford to maintain. Then their attempt to steal a multi-million-dollar estate resulted in the complete and absolute liquidation of their own lives. My estate remained untouched. The superficial damage to the front door was repaired within a week. The advanced security system continued its cyclical hum, the perimeter cameras diligently recording the quiet cul-de-sac. The corporate machinery I had built continued to function with cold, relentless efficiency, insulated from the biological failures of the people who had tried to tear it down. If your parents forged a federal judge's signature, hijacked a municipal zoning file, and weaponized a tactical sheriff's unit to kick your front door down at 6 a.m., how would you react? Would you panic and try to negotiate while armed deputies stood on your porch? Or would you calmly audit the paperwork, expose the impossible docket number, and hand the forged evidence directly back to the judge they tried to impersonate? Let me know exactly how you would handle this level of familial treason in the comments below. If you